Hello and welcome to episode 22 of MMO Weekly, presented as always by MetsmerizedOnline.com. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, along with my co-host and MMO executive editor, Mike Mayer. And Mike, the Mets season ended much shorter than I think any of us would have hoped for. The last time I spoke to you, things were pretty hopeful, and that's how much things can change in a weekend. So, just want to get your initial reactions, thoughts to this wild card weekend, and kind of just this disappointment overall.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, talking today, we kind of hoped we'd be talking about the division series starting with all 4 games being played today. And yeah, I mean, it's nothing but disappointment for a 101 win season to end. Losing in the wild card round disappointment is the only word, the perfect word. I mean, you have to, when you win 101 games, you have to think that you're going to at least win one playoff round, potentially 2. And it's not just the win total, but when the Mets have it set up like they did to essentially, this was a team that they had to go for it because of all the free agents that they have coming this offseason. So this was really the team for them to push. And for a lot of the season, they did exactly what they were supposed to do and exactly what was expected that they would do. And I think for me, I mean, we're going to delve into all this stuff, but we might as well jump into it right now. I keep going back to the trade deadline where the Mets just, I mean, you would describe it as meh. I mean, that's what it was. It was so-so. It was okay. And that's not what they needed. Like I said, this is a team that has 13 free agents, 4 out of their 5 starters, essentially their entire bullpen, their starting center fielder are all free agents. This was the time to trade more prospects to get better bats, to get another bullpen arm, to get anything. This wasn't the time to get Daniel Vogelback, Darren Ruff, Tyler Naquin, and Michael Givens. Like I said, all those guys made this team better. Vogelback and Givens played pretty well. Naquin just fell off the mountain after a good start. He was not good with the Mets, and we all know about Ruff. So I go back to that, and I mean, this isn't hindsight. A lot of people weren't happy with how the Mets finished their offseason. I mean, Billy Epler talked a couple of days before the deadline and talked about how there was a surplus of bullpen arms, and he ended up with Givens, and that was it. There was other options out there for hitters. I mean, there's guys that could have been had, and there's other guys that they could have had instead of Ruff that did much better. I mean, it wouldn't take much. It's a low bar. I mean, even Brandon Drury, who, I mean, he was worse in the second half than he was in the first half, but he was still way better than Darren Ruff was. It's just frustrating because I thought the same thing with the offseason. Obviously, they had a good offseason. You got Scherzer, you got Canna, you got Escobar, you got Ottavino, you got Marte. Not saying they didn't have a good offseason, but even then, it felt like they were still a piece or two short in the offseason. It still felt like they just couldn't finish it off. Whether it was another bullpen arm, which they probably should have added, particularly a lefty, or another power bat. I know Kyle Schwarber was a name that got knocked around for a while. And it felt like they were short that power bat and a lefty. And that's, I mean, especially the power bat, you can really tell that is something that this team missed. I know for the start of the season, the Mets scored a fair amount of runs, and they did a good job hitting with guys on base and stuff like that. But that is tough to count on. It's just not one of those things that you can count on all year. And especially in these tough games when you get against tough pitchers, it's even tougher to score runs by putting 5, 6, 7 hits. You need guys that are going to hit the ball out of the park. And I think I know we've mentioned it a bunch of times on here, is when the Mets got into their cold streaks and when they just couldn't score any runs, that's what was the big glaring thing missing, was that big power bat behind Alonso. It just wasn't there. I mean, Vogelback played pretty well for the Mets, but he was more of an on-base machine than he was a power guy for them. Ruff obviously didn't bring any power. Vientos in a short time didn't. So, and Smith and Davis to start the year didn't at DH. So I think going into when we talk about this offseason, that is certainly something that they need to find on the free agent market this season is home runs. I mean, it's pretty simple. They need to find some home runs.
Yeah, no, it's wild. I think that especially this postseason taught me how important the home run is in postseason baseball. And, I thought, more so, I agree that the trade deadline was super underwhelming. We've talked about it also, from the trade deadline on, we agreed with all that. But I think, at the end of the day, for me, it just comes down to them not executing when they needed to. They went 1-7 against the Cubs, Pirates, and Nationals during that stretch at the beginning of September. They got swept by the Cubs. They couldn't take one game in Atlanta. Now it's 2 weekends ago, the last weekend of the season against the Braves. And to me, that's where everything stems from. And I think I get more upset with the lack of urgency. And we spoke about it on the show last time, at least on Buck's end, they had to win one game. That game with deGrom was the game to win that first game. It just felt like that series, it was not managed like that was the postseason. And for the Mets, the postseason started that weekend. They needed to win the division. They didn't do it. We see how important that is now, especially with this expanded playoffs, right? With 3 games. Now, granted, I would say a 3-game series for wild card is better because it gives you more of a shot, right? Because the 1 game, anything can kind of happen. So, the 3-game is nice. At least it gives, at least 2 games for teams to try and get themselves together, whatever. But being at home, the whole series, I would say the crowd brought it. It was electric at, the atmosphere. They just, came up short. Max Scherzer, those last 2 starts of the season came up short. You mentioned how the Mets were lined up for this series, right? With Scherzer, deGrom, Bassett. Did the same thing the weekend before. And, listen, besides deGrom in both starts, and I think people, again, get skewed because when deGrom doesn't pitch like Sandy Koufax, everyone gets annoyed. But out of those last 2 weekends, deGrom made the best 2 starts in both games, or in both series, I should say, right? Scherzer and Bassett completely, came up short. I can't say what I want to say on here really, but they came up short. They didn't answer the bell. And, that's more to me the story that, the Mets big 3 and their pitchers that we talked about for months and months, how just wait till they get in the postseason in the short series and sees what happened. The Braves started it by showing them, no, maybe we're not so scared of that. And then the Padres took care of it. And, short series, shows how important just a guy getting hot, like Trent Grisham, right? He had a 600 OPS during the season, about 160 something. Went Daniel Murphy in that series against 2 great pitchers, Cy Young caliber pitchers, or Cy Young winning pitchers. It's just it's a bulk of things. I think on one hand, we should be happy that it was an exciting season. As Mets fans, and I'm not just saying this to kind of turn the coin for ownership or whatever. We're not used to really having meaningful games in the last 2 months of the season. Let's call it how it is. And last year, the Mets won 77 games. So they had a 23-win drop or 22-win drop, whatever it is. That's significant, right? But I think the hang-up is for everyone, and you alluded to it, and we're going to get into it, is this isn't a core of guys, bulk-wise, that's set to be here for a while, besides, a couple at the moment. This was a team that was built to win right now. I agree with the trade deadline stuff. And, I think that offseason wise, I think it was great, everything that they did. I just think at the end of the day, they just didn't execute when they needed to. And, I never really thought about, as far as you were saying, how hard it is to, string hits together like that all throughout the year and against better pitching. I'm more in the camp of that's their identity. And that's what you got to live and die by. And I think they just everyone started pressing, especially with Marte out and not being 100%. I know that, didn't help things the last month of this season, but, obviously disappointing, but I don't know how to feel. Like I said, it's a weird spot to be in because I think, if anything, this will motivate Cohen's camp more to want to win, right? Because you had such a fast turnaround. But at the end of the day, half your roster and probably, 4, at least 3 of your most important pieces are going to be free agents, in deGrom, Nimmo, and Bassett. So, Diaz, really, that should be the third guy, or really maybe the first one you talk about. But I just weird. I don't know. I don't know how to describe it because there's just so much looming now in this offseason.
Yeah. So, it's a lot to think about in a week span. The Mets went from being able to potentially win the division to now they're out of the playoffs, and you just have this massive offseason looming. And we're going to talk about it a lot because
Right.
A, the Mets aren't playing right now, and B, it just really is. I mean, this isn't just like, oh, hey, we got to do this offseason, maybe sign a couple guys. This is the type of offseason that people are going to be talking about decades from now.
Right.
That's how important this is, to have not only to have Nimmo, Diaz, and deGrom, those big three. I mean, those are three very, very good players that are going to be very sought after, assuming that they hit free agency, and the Mets don't sign any of those guys. And then you're talking about Bassett, who's a very good starting pitcher. Then you're talking about Carlos Carrasco, Taijuan Walker, Seth Lugo, Adam Ottavino, Trevor Williams. I mean, Joely Rodriguez, Tyler Naquin, who we mentioned. Givens could be a free agent. That's a significant amount of guys that you have to replace to get back to that 100 wins. And that's a lot of money. I know Cohen's going to spend, and I'm not doubting that he's going to spend, but I think the Mets are at roughly $162 billion. That's with deGrom, the assumption that he opts out.
Right.
So, I mean, that stuff adds up quick. I mean, if you're signing deGrom's not coming any cheaper than Max Scherzer did. That's $40 million a year right there, and you're at $200 million already. Diaz is going to get $20 million a year. Nimmo's going to get $20 million a year. It's not going to be cheap, and it's really going to be interesting to see just how they do it, because they're not going to be able to bring all those guys back.
No.
That's 4 starting pitchers. It's
right.
highly unusual that they are able to bring all 4 of those guys back. Then you have the bullpen. I mean, there's only 2 guys. I erroneously tweeted this earlier with a third guy. There's only 2 guys under contract for next year that threw at least 20 innings in the Mets bullpen this year. Drew Smith and Steven Nagosic. Right. Those are the only 2 guys. So just thinking about that, and then if you drew up the Mets projected starting rotation right now, it would be Max Scherzer and then Tyler McGill,
right,
David Peterson, and then like Joey Lucchesi, and pick a name out of a hat for the 5th starter.
Right. TBA all the time.
That just tells you, it just shows you how crazy this is. And to be honest with you, the 2 things we just talked about are that we don't feel like they finished the offseason and that they didn't finish the deadline. Right. And that's Billy Epler.
Mm-hmm.
So I know there's a lot of stuff out there saying that the Mets are going to keep Epler. I think they will. I mean, 1 season for a GM is just, in any sport, any team, regardless of what they do, almost.
As long as it's 100 games, you really can't be firing anyone after that.
Yeah, I mean,
no matter what.
Yeah, Epler and Buck are safe. I mean, Absolutely. That makes sense.
Yep.
But one thing I would say is this is a franchise-defining offseason, and Billy Epler, I mean, he doesn't have a ton of experience as being the top guy making the decisions. And the Mets have an opening at president. Now, there's mixed messages out there about whether the Mets are going to go for a business-oriented president,
right,
or if it's going to be a baseball-oriented president. For me, from what I've heard, and kind of, again, the Mets are trying to be really coy on this.
Right.
Reading between the lines from what I've heard is that the Mets really do want a baseball guy. They would love David Stearns if he becomes available, because his contract is like some state secret that no one wants to get out there. The only thing we do know is that someone reported, had they made the playoffs, he could had they made the World Series, he could opt out. Obviously, the Brewers didn't make the World Series, but beyond that, we don't really know for 100% sure that he's under contract for 2023. If he is, the Brewers owner has made it very well known in baseball circles that he does not want Stearns to go to the Mets, and that he will seek compensation if the Mets really want him. So that puts the Mets, and this is why the Mets are being so coy about this and quiet and saying, well, we're not really or putting it out there through channels that have sources from the Mets, that we're not really looking for a baseball executive, is because, let's face it, the last 2 off seasons, Cohen has gone big fish hunting, and they've struck out 2 straight off seasons.
Right.
They don't want to do that again.
Yep.
So this offseason, they're really trying to keep it quiet about what they're actually trying to do. That way you're not getting all those big names out there and then not land any of them again.
Right.
So I do think, and in the people I've talked to, I think in a perfect world, the Mets would love to have David Stearns and or someone of that type of baseball president caliber that is going to make baseball decisions, not just business decisions. So, and I think they would like to do it as soon as they can. I mean, you just saw the Giants hire a great guy from the Astros who had been running their player development, and they did that already. So I'm sure at some point the Mets can't keep everything under wraps. At some point, we'll start hearing some names, and I'd be really surprised if they weren't baseball-oriented guys.
Yeah, no, you know what? I'm going to put it out there. David Stearns, I don't need you. I am not doing this for a third winner in a row. I don't care about the Brewers owner or whatever. Brewers choked the second half. Offense wasn't good. You know who I want? The man who beat the Mets and developed the players for the 2015 World Series that the Royals just happened to let go. That is Dayton Moore. If there's a man I want in the Mets' philosophy of trying to build sustained success like the Dodgers, that's a guy to bring in. Not that, listen, Stern's great baseball person. I understand that the Brewers have been very, very successful the last, half decade under his watch or whatever. But a guy like Dayton Moore, who didn't have a lot to work with in a small market like Kansas City, to be able to develop the players like he did for that core during that, that 14, 15, 16 run for the Royals, that's a guy I would love to have in here. I don't fully also trust Billy Epler to do this all himself again this offseason. Not that, listen, he made the splash last year, brought in, I thought had a great offseason last year. Obviously, at the deadline, we agree that he got stingy, at the wrong time, I would say. But it would be nice to have someone there to work alongside with Epler. Just because it's such a, like you said, a franchise-altering offseason that is probably going to have ramifications for a long time. So, with that, I would love a guy, like I said, I guess you can't go wrong with any of them. I'm kind of sick of hearing David Stearns' name and nothing happening. So Milwaukee, keep him. You want him, keep him. With him, Steve Cohen, get whoever he wants. Opens the checkbook. So whoever else it's going to be to run the baseball operations, I think they'll be in good hands. And hopefully they do that. Like I said, I just don't like Epler having that all to himself.
And I mean, going back to talking about this, and when we'll talk about free agents, is the X factor is Steve Cohen still. I mean, the Mets had a disappointing first year, but I mean, Cohen didn't really have his hands on anything. It'd been a very short period. Now that they had a great season wins wise, but the end it the way they did. I mean, remember, Steve Cohen's a fan too. And so this is obviously frustrating for him. And he doesn't want the Mets to be the laughing stock or the team that collapsed. So he's always the wild card of, well, what is he willing to pay blank person to come do this for the Mets, be their baseball president? What is he willing to do in free agency? So I think, I mean, again, you're reading between the lines. I think he's obviously going to be upset, reasonably upset. And I think he's going to go out and spend, whether it's free agency and for a baseball person. Not just, I mean, you can always add guys around or under Epler too. If they don't end up with the president, you can always add some experienced guys or steal some guys from some good organizations. So I think he's just going to continue to add to this organization. I mean, we've seen it, whether it's in the analytics department, the minor leagues, wherever he can, the pitching machine that they got that can duplicate people's motions. He's adding money wherever he can. He's spending his money in different places. So I think he's going to continue to do that. And if he's going to do it on players and or the front office, this is really the time to do it. So it'll be interesting to see if he has like a full George Steinbrenner just blow up and just decides he's going to spend $350 million and bring someone in like Aaron Judge or something like that. I mean,
if they were one player away, if they needed an outfielder, yes, absolutely. I just don't think that they're going to be able to do something like that because they have so many positions that they need to fill and core guys that they need to bring back. And it almost brings that kind of brings me to the point I was going to also bring up as far as with deGrom, right? Now, listen, Jake's amazing. You want someone like that to be a Met for life, obviously, if you can work it out, whatever. But like you said, he's going to demand a huge salary. What Scherzer's getting, maybe more, maybe close to 45 to 50. I would assume he might want, not, it's probably going to be for 4 or 5 years because, again, he's 34. But with the amount of guys that the Mets have to pay, and especially key guys like Diaz and Nimmo and even Bassett, and also another thing, too, as far as thinking to extend some guys, like particularly Alonzo McNeil. So, is it something where in a business decision that letting Jacob deGrom, now I'm not saying walk, but if he chooses to pitch elsewhere for the same money, it's not the worst thing in the world in the sense that the Mets can then put those funds towards a lot of other needs. And you can really patchwork, not even patchwork, but bring together a decent rotation, I would say, if you let him walk, even with Scherzer at the top. Let's say you re-sign Bassett, you bring in a guy like Rondon, so to speak, like that. Maybe trade for another arm if you need to, or you re-sign Walker also. It's not a bad rotation after that. And again, if you can lock up your everyday players, guys like Nimmo, and Diaz an exception just because of how well he, the turnaround that he had this year. And obviously he pitches, has his impact when they have leads and stuff like that. But I just wonder if going all in to keep deGrom here for his career, is going to probably get the fan parade, or approval, but long term for the team, I don't know if that might not be the best thing. I don't know. And that's not, again, I'm not me saying that I want deGrom not to come back, because if it's between deGrom going to the Braves or the Phillies or the Mets, you have to overpay. Same deal with Nimmo. But I think, if he goes elsewhere outside of the NL East, that happens, I don't think it would be the worst thing in the world. And I'm curious to see what you kind of think now.
Well, yeah, I think, like you're saying, well, like we've talked about, is they have a bulk of guys. Right. Your starting center fielder, the best closer in baseball, one of the best starters in baseball, and then the entire rest of your rotation and your entire setup guys. So the Mets have to figure out a way to bring as many of those guys back. And the thing that I come back to is the fact that they already showed at the trade deadline that they don't want to trade certain prospects.
Right.
I don't necessarily agree with holding on to some of the prospects that they're making unavailable for a certain price.
Right.
Look, I get that you have to build long-term. I understand that, but you can't just spend money this offseason. There's just too many holes to fill.
Right.
There's no way you can replace this roster of free agents just through signing guys. It's just not feasible. So you're going to have to trade. So it'll be interesting to see just who they're willing to trade.
Right.
You have to imagine at this point, Francisco Alvarez came to the big leagues.
Right.
There's pretty much nothing that we can pull from his very short appearances other than that he's got the power that everyone expected.
Right.
I mean, we knew we had very good power. He showed very good power. We know that. So we know the Mets aren't getting rid of Nito. He's a great backup. He's one of the best defensive catchers in baseball. So Alvarez has already made the big leagues. They brought him up. So what are you doing with him now? What are you doing with James McCann? In a perfect world, you would obviously like someone to trade you or take James McCann off your hand. Well, guess what? His deal was backloaded. So he's actually making $12 million next year.
Right.
Good luck finding someone to give you anything for James McCann at 2 years, 24 million. Or I don't want anything. I just want you to take part of the salary.
Right.
I don't think you're going to find too many teams willing to take that salary.
Yeah.
But that's one kind of a precursor move that you have to think about to try to settle this roster, because you've already decided that Alvarez is a big leaguer. So you're not going to carry 3 catchers. At least you shouldn't. I hate carrying 3 catchers. It just really shortens a bench, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's kind of a precursor. If you can get someone to, even take $2 million a year from McCann's deal.
Right.
That's something that can go towards a bullpen arm or something.
Yeah.
You can get a decent bullpen arm or depth for that type of money. So then you've got other guys like Mark Vientos. You have Darren Ruff still under contract for next year.
Yeah.
So you have to make a decision on what you're going to do with Vientos, because he's at that point in his career where he doesn't need to play in AAA anymore, really.
Right.
To a certain extent. He's only got a short time in the big leagues. He's ready for that major league role, but you have Darren Ruff there. So are you gonna cut ties with Darren Ruff, or are you going to use Vientos to maybe get a starting pitcher because you can't bring back deGrom, Bassett, Walker, and Carrasco? Then you have Beatty.
Right.
I think 2 months ago, this conversation would have been obvious that Beatty's just your third baseman next year. But then Escobar just went off the rails. He was the best offensive player, maybe besides McNeil, for the last month and a half of the year.
Right.
And ended up having a solid offensive season. So maybe Escobar kind of saved his job for next year. So the question becomes, do you trade Beatty for a pitcher?
Right.
So you got to kind of go down the line of these different things. It's just, we're just working through it. Just imagine a GM and all the people with him trying to just sort out all of this because of just how many pieces they have to do. I can't wait. I can't wait just from like a standpoint of it's just going to be a constant news because of what they have to do, the players that they have to bring in, the players they have to replace. You got to prioritize. And I think from what I've talked to some people is I think the first thing the Mets would really like to do is get Diaz signed, sealed, and delivered before free agency hits. The people I've talked to said Cohen wants Diaz back with the Mets. He understands that he's a good closer. The narco thing puts people in the seats. It's just smart from a business standpoint. That's added value. I know someone mentioned it in baseball. It might have been Jeff Passan earlier this year. He mentioned that it really is. It's added value because of that entertainment factor with Diaz. And it doesn't help that he was the best closer. Hurt that he was the best closer in baseball this year. And that's the type of guy that I think once you get out on the open market, particularly with a market that doesn't have a ton of big time closers this year, there could be a serious bidding war. I mean,
absolutely.
Look at the Phillies. The Phillies are going to get involved. The Yankees are going to get involved. They want a closer. I mean, you have teams with money that are going to want to get involved. And I think Cohen realizes that. So that would be the first thing I would look for, is that the Mets are going to make a serious play in terms of money to get Diaz not to hit free agency.
Yeah. I mean, it's, you're going to pay for a premium, obviously. And you know, I guess you do worry with closers. They can be so volatile year to year, and we understand that. But I think the 180 that he did starting so poorly here and then turning it around like this and just being so elite, that to me, I think it alleviates at least a lot, like, you know, most of the worries. Do I think that he's going to have like a 53% K rate the rest of his career? No, but he still throws 100 with the razor blade slider, and he's now proven that he can pitch in high leverage games in New York and be successful. And then he enjoys that big moment. And, you know, he really rose to the challenge and, you know, trying to be something here. So, you know, I think that's a no-brainer. You know, deGrom aside, hopefully they do the same thing with Nimmo. You mentioned the Phillies for Diaz. They could definitely use the center fielder too. And I don't want to see, you know, a bunch of these guys getting signed in division and, you know, trying to, you know, make the Mets pay for it for a long time. So I agree. Get that done as soon as they can. You know, I guess the whole thing with deGrom looms with everything on top of it. Who knows what's going to happen?
Well, I think so. To kind of run through the process, the Mets are going to give qualifying offers to several players. I mean, so that's your first step. deGrom, he's going to opt out. Then the Mets will give him the qualifying offer. Diaz will get the qualifying offer. Nimmo will get the qualifying offer. And then you have a couple of guys. Well, it's like, well, what's going to happen? So Bassett has a mutual option of $19.9 million.
Right.
I would guess that he's going to decline that simply because he's 33, so he'll want to get like a multi-year deal.
Right.
But I don't think he'll top $19 million a year. but he might be able to get a 3-year deal. So obviously, if he declines the 19.9 million, then the Mets obviously should give him a qualifying offer because it's going to be right around the same money per year.
Right.
So either way, if he accepts it, then great. I mean, that's a pretty good deal for the Mets to be able to get their number 3 starter at that price and only have to guarantee a year. And then I think the next interesting one is Taijuan Walker. He has a $7.5 million option with a $3 million buyout player option. Obviously, he's going to decline $7.5 million.
Right.
He's just worth more than that as a 3-4 starter. I mean, a 3-4 starter these days are going to get at least $10 million a year.
Yep.
So he's going to decline that. So then that becomes kind of a tougher situation for the Mets is, do they want to give him a qualifying offer?
Right.
1 year, it's going to be around $19 million.
Yep.
Is Taijuan Walker that type of pitcher that you want to pay $19 million to?
Right.
Multiple years? No, of course not. But 1 year, when you have so much uncertainty in your rotation, maybe he could be that type of guy, especially if in early conversations with deGrom, you just know he's not coming.
Right.
And you know that Bassett's made some interesting comments about the pressures in New York, and he played in Oakland his whole career, and went to New York, and there was talk of it this spring during spring training. Well, is he really going to fit in New York? And look, Bassett before his last 2 starts of the year pitched great. Yeah, but the last 2 times he's talked about the pressures of New York.
Yep.
And different stuff like that. And that always makes your hair stand up a little bit. Well, is he going to be able to handle this, or does he even want to? Is he a guy that not everyone wants to pitch in New York, and that's perfectly fine if he wants to go SoCal and pitch in SoCal. I mean, it is what it is. Everyone has different preferences. So you got to kind of feel out those guys. And then, it's very possible that the Mets end up, I would think at least 4 guys get the qualifying offer and potentially a 5th. And then you go from there, because if you give it to 5 guys, let's say, you would like to think that one of those pitchers is going to accept. And then thankfully you've got one of your rotation spots already filled up. And like I said, they really do want to get Diaz done. And you alluded to Nimmo. That's really, I mean, again, this is like early speculation and stuff like that. But Nimmo is the name that I'm hearing the most outside of Diaz. Is that they're going to be serious about Nimmo. They want to keep him here long term. Look, he's been with the Mets his entire pro career. He's in a great spot with the Mets. They've helped him improve the last couple of years with this defense and center. And the Mets aren't stupid too. They've seen the free agent center field market. Essentially, Aaron Judge, Brandon Nimmo, and then
that's it.
Like 6 guys. Six guys that played for the Mets and weren't good, like Kevin Pillar and Travis Janikowski and some other guys. So the Mets aren't stupid. They know just how bad the center field market is. So that's another guy, if they could, they would really like to get before he hits the open market. That would be, I mean, I don't think you can imagine a better scenario for the Mets. Say they sign Diaz and Nimmo before free agency even starts. If they were able to do that, I mean, that gives them such a jump start on an important offseason. And I don't want to say safety net because they have so much else to do, but it does kind of give you that feeling of, we have those added wins with Nimmo and Diaz if we do miss out on some of the other pieces that we want to add. So I think the Mets are going to be aggressive with those 2 guys early and try to do as much as they can to make sure that they stay in New York.
That's best case scenario. I love to hear that. I think it's absolutely necessary if they want to continue, to build upon what they did. Those 2 guys are part of this core. 1,000%. That would be awesome. It'll be very, very interesting because I feel like at this point, you mentioned, maybe Cone will go on one of those George Steinbrenner, angry spending sprees. I think they're kind of in a position where he has to. You paid Max Scherzer $43 million for next, now if this year, next 2 years, to be here. It's a win now team. He's expressed that he wants to win. And there's, as far as Alvarez, Beatty, outside of that, really, there's not a ton going, a ton going on with depth in the minor leagues as it's improving as we know, but it's nowhere near, I would say to, impact a major league club right now to win, run it consistently World Series. So he's going to have to spend like crazy. And like you mentioned too, they're going to probably have to part with a top prospect or two to continue to add and get better, because like you said, they're not going to be able to sign every single free agent, but I would assume it's still all hands on deck. It really has to be. They've made it that. As a fan, I'm happy about that. Maybe it's PTSD. I'm just saying it because I don't want to go through another rebuild or anything like that, especially with all this juice that just happened after this year. But I don't think they really have a choice. I'm sure Cohen knows that. He's especially since he's expressed that he wants to win right away and has spent the money the last couple of years from first Lindor and now Scherzer and the like that they brought in last year. I think they're going to have to just build on. It's going to be real tough. For them to, after a 101 win season, especially with an older manager too, and Buck, who's, I'm sure he's just hanging on. He wants to win a World Series and then go get the hell out of here, I'm sure. So, it's all hands on deck for the next couple of years. They're kind of in a corner. I don't hate it. Hopefully it works out, right? Because now we know the Mets won the offseason last year. Best team in the one of the best teams in the regular season. If they would have won the division, Buck probably would have manager of the year. But they have the quick hook. And then it all kind of comes crashing down very fast. So, you have to just keep building on it. I really don't know what's going to happen. I would be thrilled if they were able to lock up those two guys, like you said, and whatever kind of happens with deGrom happens, you leave it to kind of chance and you go from there. But it's just so many guys.
Well, and to your point, talking about how obviously Cohen wants to build a long-term winner, and we're talking about the fact that this was a win now team. Right. Next year's a win now team too, because you don't know what you have in Scherzer after next year. He can opt out.
Right.
Alonso and McNeil are going to be free agents. So yeah, you or Alonso's going to be free agent, McNeil next year, but you have this sense of you want to build a long-term winner, but you also have this sense of urgency because you are spending. I mean, you spend $43 million on Scherzer this year and next year, and the amount you spend on deGrom this year. So yeah, it's a win long-term, and they want to develop this system,
right?
And it is getting better by the year, but
yeah,
they're in that position, like you said, where even if they don't go nuts, he still has to spend a lot just to bring this team back to the 101 win roster. I think thinking about it, that's probably the craziest thing to me is that just to get back to that 100 win roster, you have to spend a lot of money just to get close to that team. And that's without. So talk about the 101 win roster team, and then the power bat we were talking about, and then a left-handed reliever. So, I mean, that's like 15 players that we're talking about that the Mets essentially have to add. And because you noted that while the Mets do have some good prospects, Beatty, Vientos, Alvarez, other than those guys, they don't really have, especially on the pitching end, they have a couple arms, like we saw Bryce Montes de Oca this year at the end, and they have a couple other bullpen arms, and we saw Jose Buto, who's going to be starting pitching depth. But from the pitching side, they don't really have that guy where you're like, all right, he's going to come in like Logan Gilbert or Spencer Strider. Like the Mets don't have that guy where you can be like, all right, we don't have to sign Carrasco, Walker, and Bassett. We have this guy. Well, the Mets don't have that guy. They can't be like, oh, we don't need to sign Lugo, Ottavino, Trevor Williams because we have this guy in the bullpen. Again, they don't have that sure prospect for the pitching end. And they certainly don't have it in center. I mean, Jake Mangum, who's come on the show, is a nice depth piece, and I think he'll play in the big leagues next year, but you can't put him in center field on opening day on this team. That's not the spot that the Mets are in, and that would be unfair to Jake. So they have some depth prospects, and maybe Alvarez starts at catcher and Beatty plays a role at third at some point. But yeah, on the pitching side, this is really a team that's going to have to fill those holes with the free agents or through trade. And it's going to be a lot of transactions. I don't want to wish time away, but I kind of wish we would just run right through the playoffs and the Braves and Phillies lose, the Yankees lose, and someone else wins, like the Mariners. That would be the Mariners or Guardians with Andres Jimenez and Ahmed Rosario. That would be cool to see them win, something like that. And let's go ahead and get to the off season and let's see what happens. Winter meetings. I'm excited. I'm going to the winter meetings in San Diego this year. So all that, let's get going to the off season moves, and it's going to be a wild ride. That's for sure.
Yeah, no lockout this year, so normal off season. Things can get going. Like last year was fun for the lockout with so many players signing. That was a lot of fun. But it'll be nice to have a normal off season. I would imagine, like you alluded to, kind of Diaz and Nimmo. I'm sure other guys as well. Teams will try and lock players up and things like that. It should be good. It's going to be very interesting. Like you said, you'll be at the winter meetings. It's frustrating still that the off season's here now for the Mets, but it just means more things to talk about for us. I think next week we're going to actually dive into, we didn't do it this week, but next week we're going to dive into Buck's first year as a Met. I think we're going to kind of grade him a little bit and kind of go a little more in depth of, what we saw, what we can kind of, see what we'll get from him next year. But, unfortunate end to the season, but thank you everyone for listening throughout the season this year with us. It's been a lot of fun. And like Mike said, let's get this off season rolling. Should be very interesting no matter what. A lot of things going on. We'll keep you updated with everything. And until then, let's go Mets.